Welcome to the Pharmaceutical Company question and answer session. I will just briefly introduce the session. So the questions for this session were collected during many months when we were doing Science on Tour, when we were talking peer-to-peer to Duchenne families, Duchenne parents. We wanted to know what they want to know, which questions they want to ask, and we have collected them all. So today, no question can be asked on the day to ensure the ABPI code of conduct, because we know in the UK it's very strict, so I would like to warn you in advance. Thank you very much for that. So today, there will be 18 questions. We have 6 participants who will be representing 6 pharmaceutical companies. And our wonderful moderators will be Anamika Asma-Rus and Giovanni Baranello. Over to you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that introduction. And I'll be the bad cop, so I have my standardized timekeeping device. You all have 4 minutes max to answer. Don't make me be the alarm. Giovanni will be the good cop. Before we start, I'm just going to ask each of you, starting at the, well, your right, your left, to introduce yourself. So who are you, what is your function, and which companies do you work for?
Sure. Hi there. I'm Sam Collins. I'm VP of Clinical Development at Edgewise Therapeutics.
Hi, I'm Wendy Kane. I'm a rare conditions partner working with Roche.
Hello, I'm Ione Woolacott. I'm a Senior Medical Affairs Manager. I work in the Medical Affairs team within Rare Disease at Pfizer UK.
Hello, I'm Kerry Nip. I work for Santera and I'm Head of Medical Affairs.
Hello everybody, my name is George Sheehan. I'm with Sarepta and I'm in our Medical Affairs team. I'm based here in the UK, out in Exeter, sunny Exeter. So very nice to be with all of you today and looking forward to hearing your questions too.
Thank you. Good morning, Erwan Delage. I am Head of Medical Affairs within Dyne Therapeutics and based in Paris.
Okay, thank you very much. And there's actually 2 microphones, so if one could go back, then it will save time. So we're going to start with the first question. So I'll do all the odd questions. Giovanni will do the even questions. So the first question is for Sarepta. Are drugs approved in the US quicker than in the UK?
I'll stick to my 4 minutes or less. So we got this question yesterday. I think it's a really good question, and I don't know. Like I think there's probably variable opinions. You're seeing what the MHRA do here in the UK. It's quite similar to what EMA does in Europe, and then also the FDA is another gold standard in the US. So, for example, there's a recent study that showed that around of the drugs that are approved between EMA and FDA in the last couple of years, around 86% were approved quicker by the FDA. And obviously we've heard examples where, for example, in Duchenne, you mentioned yesterday about Lauren getting approval quicker here in Europe. So there is obviously exception to the rules. So why does this happen? Well, you know, review times are generally longer in the EU, and there's also a stop clock system. And during the review times, when EU, for example, advisors come back to sponsors, they stop the clock. So obviously, if they come back a lot of times, this can cause significant delays. And also in the FDA, there's fast track designation. They have an approval pathway called accelerated approval, and this occurs in diseases such as Duchenne, where there is a high unmet need, not many treatment options, and this allows an approval to occur based on a surrogate endpoint or a biomarker that is reasonably likely to have to predict a clinical benefit. And then if the FDA say, yes, this is reasonably likely to predict a clinical benefit, then they will give an accelerated approval. And then you can follow up, the sponsor follows up with a confirmatory trial to confirm that clinical benefit or not. And then basically the FDA can give a traditional approval after that. So the question is, is it shorter in what's happening in the UK? So there has been advances. For example, there was £10 million announced recently to transform MHRA to become more competitive in terms of review times, and it was announced by Jeremy Hunt, one of the politicians. I probably forget his name, but they announced this 10 million. And what's going to happen is that MHRA will actually take the opinion of trusted regulators such as the FDA or those in Europe into consideration when they are going to give their own approval. And this should lead to faster approvals potentially happening in the UK, but we don't know yet what this looks like. But I think it does give more opportunity for trials and treatment options here in the UK, but we don't have a glimpse into what this picture looks like. So hopefully we can hear something early 2024 is when it should begin. So I hope that answers the question.
Thank you. We have here the second question for Edgewise Therapeutics. So, do the new drugs therapies have to be tested on every age group before becoming available to everyone? 4 minutes.
I guess there's two parts to this, really. You've got being available to everyone means that the drug has to be approved by a regulator. So, is it safe and effective? And then you have to have someone like NICE or in other countries, different bodies, make it available, as in, is it, do they pay for it, reimburse for it? So the first part, in a short answer, yes, you do have to do every age group, but that looks different in different ages. So the regulator will want to see evidence that the drug is safe in every age. So that's particularly relevant as you go down ages. So if your trial, say, is in 4 years and up, you don't have evidence that the drug is safe in a 2-year-old. So you'll usually generate evidence in say, a trial of 2 to 4-year-olds, and then going younger, maybe even 6 months to 2 years. Now, it's very difficult to show the drug is effective in the younger children. So if, like in Duchenne, and you have a mechanism of action that is relevant to all stages of the disease, you can go and say, look, it's safe in the younger kids. Of course, it's going to work in the same way, and we've shown it works in older kids. Then you'll get a label, essentially an approval in those younger age groups. That works a different way as you get older, because what works in young ambulant boys might not work in older non-ambulant boys. So you then have that balance of demonstrating the safety, but also some evidence that it's going to be effective in the older boys. So it is a mixture, but at all times you do have to demonstrate the drug is safe in all the age groups. And then becoming available, the same process again will be used by bodies who are deciding whether the drug is cost effective to be reimbursed. So you'll have to have evidence that, for example, you should be given to a 2-year-old because you can make a meaningful change to the trajectory of their disease. So there's two parts to it becoming available, but really it's that balance of is it safe, is it effective, and what evidence do you have from the clinical trials in those two parts.
You're all doing very well for time, so congratulations for that. While my assistant moves us to the next slide. So this one is for Dine. How long is the period between a successful clinical trial and the drug being available in the clinic?
Yeah, this is a very interesting question and complex. I'm going to address this question from general perspective because there are different ways to get the drug accessible across different countries. What I would like just to highlight before addressing this question, I would like to add successful registrational trial, because in order to register the drug, to get it the marketing authorization, we need to have a successful registration trial. After this phase, we have two different additional options, phases. The first one is to receive the marketing authorizations. So the drug manufacturer should apply for marketing authorization. After the marketing authorization, there's also the price and reimbursement, getting funding of these drugs. So there are two complex and different steps to get a drug accessible to everyone within the indication approved. In terms of indication approval from regulatory authorities, it varies, it depends from countries. Within the FDA is different in terms of timelines, in Europe is as well different. What I would like to say is that for orphan disease where there is an unmet need, we do have accelerated review as mentioned by previous colleagues, which accelerate the review by regulators. Again, it varies. I cannot share timelines and because it varies from one country, from the FDA, from the EMA, from HRA. On the top of that, once we have the marketing authorization within the country, we do have the reimbursement, and the company should apply for funding reimbursement. It also takes time. It varies from one country to another. On average, there are countries who provide funding within 6 months, like in Germany, it's faster. In other countries, it might take 2-3 years. In Spain, we know that it's it takes 4 years to get reimbursement. What I would like just to highlight before ending this topic, it's extremely important the role that patient advocacy and pharma companies, they do play beforehand in setting up the clinical trials. Why I'm saying this? Because by incorporating the needs, we really help support getting these drugs developed faster and access faster. Because if we capture your needs, we do increase also your awareness toward different policymakers, and by capturing your needs in our trials, it helps to get the drug faster to the patients. So this is what we did at Dyne. We worked with all patient advocacy groups across the globe to incorporate your feedback in the design of our trials to make the drug development faster and accessible to patients. Thank you.
Okay, and maybe just to reiterate what you were just saying, it's really important to measure in a clinical trial something that is relevant to the patients, because the payers want to pay for something, for a treatment that does something that's relevant for the patient. I think that's what you were saying. I'm going to hand over to you.
So the next question is for Pfizer. How does managed access and orphan drug approval in Scotland change access to drugs? Will this mean drugs at late stages of the regulatory process can get into the hands of patients more quickly?
So timely access to medicines for patients in Scotland is dependent on several essential review processes. So first, the Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency, so the MHRA, evaluates their safety and effectiveness to consider granting the medicine a marketing authorisation or licence in Great Britain. Following this, the Scottish Medicines Consortium, or the SMC, performs a clinical and cost-effectiveness assessment of that medicine to consider whether the NHS will pay for it. So special consideration can be given to medicines intended for people with rare or ultra-rare diseases. For example, the MHRA can consider a medicine for orphan designation, which can lead to marketing authorisation with orphan status. Once this has been granted, then companies can apply to the SMC to consider a medicine for ultra-orphan designation and entry into the ultra-orphan pathway. And this assesses medicines intended for people with ultra-rare conditions, so they have to be chronic and disabling and affect fewer than 1 in 50,000 people, so that's about 100 people or fewer in Scotland. So do these processes actually allow patients in Scotland faster access to medicines for rare diseases? Well, being awarded orphan designation by the MHRA does not accelerate decision-making by the MHRA regarding granting it a marketing authorisation. However, the SMC's ultra-orphan pathway may speed up access to rare disease medicines in Scotland, and this is for 2 reasons. Firstly, the ultra-orphan pathway allows greater flexibility and pragmatism when assessing medicines with uncertainty around data or a high upfront cost, which is often the case for rare disease medicines. And without this approach, the SMC might not recommend the medicine at all, meaning no access at all, or access is delayed while a resubmission has to occur. Secondly, the SMC can recommend a medicine for interim acceptance. This is for ultra-orphan medicine. So this allows patients in Scotland earlier access to a medicine that is deemed to be clinically effective, but where more data are needed regarding both clinical and cost effectiveness. And access is allowed for a period of up to 3 years through something called a patient access scheme, which is similar to NICE's managed access schemes, while further data are being collected. The company then makes an updated submission to the SMC, who re-evaluates the evidence to decide whether the medicine should be made routinely available on the NHS in Scotland. Hence, this SMC's ultra-orphan pathway potentially allows people in Scotland to access certain rare disease medicines faster than before this pathway was introduced in 2018. More recently, the MHRA has introduced the Innovative Licensing and Access Pathway, or ILAP, which is to support innovative approaches to the safe, timely and efficient development of medicines. And the aim is to actually accelerate access across the UK. And rare disease and innovative medicines are in focus, and the SMC is a permanent partner within ILAP, as well as other UK organisations. So these developments are a step in the right direction for people with rare diseases, but there is still more work to be done to improve access to medicines across the UK.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. The next question, well, there could be a yes or no answer to this one, but I assume that the people that ask the questions want you to also elaborate. So it's for Roche. Is the impact on Brexit, of Brexit on the access of drugs fully understood?
Yes.
Please elaborate.
You've got 3 minutes and 90 seconds back. Or 3 minutes and 50 seconds back. So in terms of the impact of Brexit, we've heard the initials MHRA quite a few times, and it's the Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency. So it's the regulatory agency that we have here in the UK. And going through that process of achieving a license through the regulation process is actually just the first step. And then, as many of my colleagues here on stage have mentioned, it's then the next step for any medicine here in the UK is then to be reviewed for the clinical and cost effectiveness, which will be done either through NICE or the SNC. So we are now no longer a member of the EU. So as part of that, we now are no longer a member of the European Medicines Agency, or the EMA. Now, as with many things to do with Brexit, there are positives and there are negatives as part of that. However, what that does mean is the MHRA now is independent to actually review all of the medications with a UK lens. So it can mean that for some medicines, we may have access to medicines that aren't available in the EU or have different criteria for access than in the EU. And it could also happen the other way, that there could be a medicine that is available in the EU with particular criteria, and the MHRA have chosen not to follow or not to have a similar route in terms of access. So one of the things that being independent and having our flexibility here in the UK is that the MHRA have decided on a brand new approach. And one of those is the International Recognition Regulatory Scheme, a regulatory procedure. And this will come in 2024. And Gerard actually mentioned it as one of the new things that are coming. Now, this will mean that the MHRA has the opportunity to align with or look at access from other countries' regulatory bodies. And that can be right across the globe. So we're not exactly sure how this will work in practice, as it will only begin in 2024. It's a brand new process for us here in the UK. So we need to see exactly how that will pan out, whether that will be a benefit or a negative from the new Brexit or the new regulation approach that we have here in the UK because of Brexit. So yes, we understand it to a certain perspective. However, it can be a positive and it can be a minus.
So the next very simple question is for Santera. What are the biggest barriers in the UK for getting a drug approved on the NHS?
So this answer draws on a few of the answers that we've already had. There are several steps to getting a drug approved on the NHS, and the biggest barrier is that you have to overcome and pass all of those steps. So the first step is to get a marketing authorization from the NHRA. And here there are several options. So we've already talked about the various procedures that will be coming in place. So I'll just highlight one option. And one option is that a drug gains a positive CHMP approval from the EMA based on its clinical data. And then it's granted a marketing authorization by the MHRA. But we've heard that there are several options already and will be coming. Then the pharmaceutical company must engage with NICE and submit for an appraisal, such as a single technology appraisal. And this involves submitting a dossier of data for assessment. And the technology appraisal process from NICE usually is around a year. It can be shorter, it can be longer, depending on the data and the discussions. And after all of that, if the drug gains a positive recommendation from NICE, then it should be made available on the NHS, usually within 3 months. Short answer.
Thank you very much. So all these questions were on regulatory aspects and access. We're now moving to a new series of questions, and these are on clinical trial processes. And the first one is for Edgewise. If a child responds well to a drug in the clinical trial, will he continue getting that drug after the clinical trial is finished?
Okay, so again, a sort of qualified answer here, and perhaps some context to something that many of you might not understand. We sit up here and give our sort of titles in pharma, and some colleagues here are from medical affairs. My title is clinical development. So as a clinical development professional, and that's where I've spent my whole career, my part of the process is essentially taking drugs from discovery up to the trials that are registrational. And although I work with colleagues in the later stages, the post-approval or the commercial aspects are not something that I have a lot of experience with, so there will be a qualified answer on that part of it. In terms of a trial itself, so if you're talking about a 12-month and 18-month trial where that finishes and you're still in the development process, so you haven't approved the drug, you're still generating the evidence, on the whole, there will be an open label extension provided. And that's in the interests of everyone. We want to continue providing the drug to those who feel they're benefiting. We want to continue to generate evidence on the long-term safety and the long-term effectiveness of the drug. So generally, while the drug is still in development, you'll provide extension studies to continue access. Now, it can change once the drug is close to approval or around that time, and there's been a lot of mention of compassionate use and managed access schemes. So those are procedures in which the drug can continue to be provided when it's not within the context of a clinical study. On the whole, when the drug becomes approved in a country, that can switch over. So they might not stay in the study. You may not become under the compassionate use scheme. But as I say, that's I have to say that's not something that I deal a lot with. But in the context of what we do, we certainly provide those extension studies following the clinical trial itself.
And maybe just to tell you, this is also something you can check when you want to enter a trial. When you consider a trial, you can ask the clinician, like, is there an open label stage afterwards, yes or no? And then that can help you decision making if there's multiple options.
Especially if the patient needs to be transitioned, to the adult center or so on. Have you, could you mention also the early access to medicine scheme in the UK, which is another...
If someone else on the stage maybe could help me with that, because they're probably more aware of that than I am.
There is another option where, while on compassionate use, at least is my understanding, you apply for single patients. There is the possibility, and it happened before for other medication for rare diseases like spinal muscular atrophy, where you can apply to have a sort of early access to patients on a compassionate basis, where basically the company is providing the medication and each trust can apply to provide this medication to their own patients. So it's another option that exists in the
Exactly.
UK.
It's I'm not expert UK market, but it happens before getting the marketing authorization. It's an opportunity for patients. So the pharma company provides for free the drug, waiting to get the marketing
waiting
authorization.
for the final approval. So the next one is for Dine. Why is the focus of most clinical trials on ambulatory boys?
Yes, excellent question. This is true. This was true. It's not anymore. More companies are focusing on ambulatory patients. They have an inclusive approach. To answer this question, there are two aspects. The first aspect is the duration of clinical trials and the natural progression of the disease. So the progression of the disease, we do know that most patients, DMD, they go from ambulant to non-ambulant, and they do lose muscle function decline during the ambulant phase. And to capture this decline and to make improvement in the treatment and the assessment, it's easier, less challenging to determine the efficacy of a drug in the ambulant phase, where do we have physical assessment like 6-minute walking distance, 10 meters run walk. We do have North Star assessment and so on. For non-ambulant patients, it's challenging because, as mentioned, the duration of the trials. Having worked on the STRIDE registry, Translarna, Ataluren at PTC, we noticed that we could observe improvement in cardiac and pulmonary function on the long term, within 3-4 years. And this is something from ethical perspective, we could not have clinical trials, double-blind, or versus standard of care for 3 years. So this is one of the reasons why, it was more focused. We were focusing as pharma industry on including ambulant patients. So it was the duration of the trials, and it was also the challenges in terms of getting improvement in cardiac and pulmonary functions, mainly in non-ambulant boys. Saying that, as mentioned, we worked, as Diane would like to give our opinion, with patient advocacy with the clinicians. In our ongoing phase 1, it's the first in a human trial that we are running currently in DMD patients, international trial. We are including non-ambulant boys as well in our trial. And this is really the trend, more and more pharma companies. If we look at the statistics, I would say 30 to 40% of trials currently, they are including non-ambulant boys.
And maybe to add, so I think that the fact that there's now more non-ambulant trials is also because the Duchenne field, the patient organization said, hang on, why aren't there non-ambulatory trials? And then the company said, yeah, but because we don't have outcome measures. Yeah. And then as a field, with the clinicians, you said, okay, let's develop these outcome measures. Let's ask the patients, which arm functions are important to you? Which other functions, aside from walking, are important to you? And then based on that, these outcome measures were developed, and now you have something to measure in the non-ambulant trials. So I think it's also a nice example where the patient community filled a gap that was clearly there. Sorry to go over my own time. Moving on to the next question for Pfizer. What factors determine where a clinical trial takes place?
So we've heard some questions about this both yesterday and today about why some countries are selected and not selected. So I hope this answer helps to address some of these. So at Pfizer, we believe that all people and patients should have the opportunity to receive the latest treatments, and that starts with equitable access to clinical trials. So many different factors are considered when considering which countries and which trial sites within each country are participating in a clinical trial. So we consider not only the trial design, but also key clinical, commercial, and logistical factors. And in addition, we can consider factors which are part of regulatory requirements, so pre-specified by regulatory bodies like the MHRA, and clinical trial registrational requirements, which guide how trials must be registered, assessed, and conducted in that country. So we always start by assessing a country's capability to conduct that trial. And we analyse the patient population in that country, so the number of patients living with that condition who might be able to participate in that trial. And that's really important to ensure that centres across that country have can realistically identify and recruit enough patients into that trial, which is really, really important for trials evaluating medicines in people with rare diseases. We also look at past country experience, both in that disease and in that therapy area, including the trial experience in those areas across that country. We analyse how trial sites in the country have enrolled participants previously in trials within the same disease or therapy area, how long it took to set up the trials at these sites, and how the performance and quality indicators from previous trials. We also look at what other trials are being planned or conducted in that country within the same disease area, and this is really important to ensure that the sites have the capacity to recruit enough patients to each of the different trials. In terms of specific clinical centres being selected as a trial site, we assess their clinical and trial experience of the investigators and the teams there in that disease area and that therapy area, and we consider the accessibility of trial sites across that country for patients and their families. We also take into account feedback from investigators, trial teams, previous participants and their families, and from the patient community, including patient organisations, and organisations who are focused in optimising research and trial access and conduct in that country. We also have to consider more logistical aspects. So can the site receive, store and administer that medicine? Can they participate in stringent monitoring requirements? Can they gather data for that trial? And we also assess specific performance and quality indicators for that particular site. So all of these factors help us to determine which countries and which trial sites within countries can participate in a clinical trial. And this is really important to ensure that patients and people have timely access to trials in their country wherever possible, and that trials are conducted with the utmost quality. It also ensures that both regulatory and registrational requirements are met, and that meaningful data about a medicine are collected and analysed to support future trials and regulatory and reimbursement submissions.
The next question is for Sarepta, following still the process of setting up a clinical trial. What is the biggest challenge when setting up clinical trial? Is it harder to recruit participants or more the setting up phase in which you have to secure funding and so on?
Yeah, it's a very good question again. I mean, they're both definitely big challenges. I'd argue that recruiting participants is even more challenging now. So, for example, we know that DMD is a rare disease. We see in other areas that trials can have 1,000 patients per group, and that's just not feasible in Duchenne. So now trials have smaller number of participants, and really you need to take a global approach to really capture and bring these trials around the world. But we also know that even the inclusion criteria in clinical trials can be very specific. They can range for, age of diagnosis, standard of care needs to be implemented. There's other factors that will actually limit the population even further. So we talked about ambulatory, non-ambulatory. These small changes reduce the number of participants that can be eligible. And we do know clinical trials, the idea behind them is to show that a potential drug is safe and effective in a population and then to expand into a different population. So there's definitely challenges there. And we talked about natural history data. It's very important to understand that. We didn't understand the natural history in non-ambulatory patients. Now we have really good assessments, performance, upper limbs. We know the importance of different measures. For example, we look now at forced vital capacity in the lung. We know that the heart is also very important to look at. So, recruiting participants is definitely one challenge. It's something that I think everyone's working on. There's a lot of studies going on at the moment. I mean, you see us all up here talking. There's a lot of studies, and I hope that means that all the sponsors need to stay at the very highest level because it's competitive, and you should be choosing which study works best for you. And I think at the end of the day, it's just, you're almost, it's the ball is in your court where you should be expecting a very high standard from sponsors. And then in securing funding, I mean, it's a difficult area. It's a rare disease. I think, nothing about, for example, in the biotechnology industry, about 1% of companies actually will reach profitability. And that just means there's less money coming into that area. It means also that these trials are very hard to have a successful trial. We've seen across the years trials failing. I think we've learned from every single one of those trials something new, and we can apply those to the next trial for stratification factors. So I think every year we are learning. And for example, trials are very expensive, tens, hundreds of millions to do a trial. And at the end, if it fails, it's a big problem. But again, at each stage we are learning. And I think, the most important thing is that we can keep these trials running and hopefully bring therapies to the market. And I think it's definitely something we're all working on. But we're here to listen to the community and to get impact or get your opinion on our studies and how we can move forward with them too.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to rephrase this next question because there is an answer at the start. So for Santhera, why is there not an adult arm to a clinical trial when there's many men living with Duchenne who are very willing to take part, and then offered suggestion is probably cost or too much muscle damage?
Thank you. So clinical trials are designed with defined endpoints, with defined population types, as well as the numbers of patients needed to meet statistical relevancy and power. So trials are designed to test the safety and efficacy of new treatments for a specific condition and or population. And adults with Duchenne may have different disease characteristics and progression than younger patients, which could affect the outcome measures and endpoints of the trials. So once again, we're talking about numbers here, as in patient numbers. And for example, some trials may focus on delaying loss of ambulation, in which case the researchers and sponsors may choose to only include an adult arm in a trial if it's suitable or beneficial for them. So in addition, adults with Duchenne are also a relatively small and heterogeneous population, which makes it difficult to recruit and retain them depending on the endpoints that are being examined.
The next question is from Roche. We have talked a lot yesterday about the neurobehavioral and neurodevelopmental comorbidities in children with Duchenne muscular dystrophy, and we know that there are specific restrictions like inclusion and exclusion criteria to take part. So this question is related to the fact that if a child is taking any medication for behavioral or cognitive changes, if this can affect potentially taking part in clinical trials.
A great question. Thank you, Professor Baranello. And I think the simple answer to the question would be, it depends. In terms of, we would consider this as being inclusion or exclusion criteria. And there are many different things that need to be considered. It could be age, it could be medication, and it may be that are considered as part of whether they would include a particular patient or a child to take part in a clinical trial, or it may be that it's on a list that's excluded. The decision whether it be a clinical trial that's being led by an academic institution or whether it's a clinical trial that's being led by a pharmaceutical company, a team of experts would come together, and the key question is, what are they trying to investigate? What is the trial trying to show or to prove? And then they would need to consider what things could impact on showing whether the big question that they're trying to investigate, what could impact on that. And in some cases, the treatments that patients are taking, the treatments that boys are taking, could potentially be perceived as impacting on the clinic, on the question or the clinical trial that's being investigated. So that, unfortunately, is the answer of it depends. Depends on the clinical trial, it depends on what they're trying to investigate, and it depends then on what's perceived as potentially impacting on that trial. So we really can't comment on any individual clinical trial because, unfortunately, it depends.
Yeah, because we have probably 30 seconds, I would like to add, in many cases, the center where the clinical trials is run does not directly know that child, because, we cannot have clinical trials in every centers in the UK. And what happens is that the clinicians that are running the trial are reaching out, the local clinicians, to know more about that specific child. Because although there are some exclusion criteria, sometimes it's also a matter to understand how much compliant, that child might be in performing all the assessment, because of course you want to be able to capture the changes. And of course, if you don't have enough cooperation, enough compliance, you cannot measure, and you can basically screw all the results of the study. So sometimes there are like contraindication, like if you are taking a medication that may interfere with the medication under investigation. Of course, you cannot be included. Some other times it's a matter to understand how much compliance we may have and how this can ensure that we run, a study that allow us to interpret the results at the end. So it's complicated, but it's important, to interact with the local centers, to understand more, because they probably know more about your child and their condition, their compliance.
Maybe to summarize briefly, if you do a trial, you want to make sure that if the answer is the drug doesn't work, that it is because the drug doesn't work and not because there was something wrong with the design or patients who shouldn't have been included were included and then messing up the results. So you really want to know that you can trust the answer that you get because there's so much at stake. So the next question is a long one for Edgewise. If no longer ambulant, would it be beneficial to have a clinical trial to see if the upper muscles, so the heart and the lungs, but also the limb muscles, can benefit? Many adults with Duchenne, although losing the ability to walk, would appreciate upper body strength to keep good quality of life going. And I once was interviewed by a Dutch boy of 14 or 15, and he said, what about the 6-minute walk test? I don't care about the 6-minute walk test. I want the 6-minute PlayStation test. So I think that relates with this question, so please.
Yeah, I've probably got the longest question, the shortest answer. So yes, and perhaps some sort of context to the clinical trials that we run, and we've talked a lot about, why do we have this arm, why do we not include these patients, and Annemie kind of hit on it really, that I think we all start with the principle that we'd like everyone to get access to the medication. We'd love if everyone of all shapes, sizes, descriptions with Duchenne could come into the trials, but you don't want to risk missing a drug that works. So if your trial fails, even though the drug could have an effect, essentially that's detrimental to the community as well, because that drug may never get to the wider population because of the trial design. So when we're restricting populations, say we're only having ambulant boys to start with, what we're really trying to do is remember we're generating evidence, so finding a way that we can show that it truly works and it's truly safe. And often you start with a defined population and work out. So the intent, and certainly with what we're doing, is that absolutely the drug can benefit non-ambulant boys and preserve upper limb function, because that's incredibly important. But you've got to do it in a kind of stepwise approach. So once you know that it works, or you get details on how the drug is metabolized, all these kind of other aspects, the more you learn about the drug, the more you can work out into other populations and start building the evidence for every age group, be that very young children, non-ambulant adults. So it's a scientific puzzle we're putting the pieces together of, and sometimes that's many different trials of different populations, but everyone is important. It just takes time to put those pieces together, and sometimes you even have to get your approval in a narrow population, so you can, going back to the other question, generate the funding and the interest to help you be able to go out and run the further trials. So it's all about pieces of the puzzle, not that anyone is more important than anyone else.
The next one is also a general, so it's a new session, quite complicated, I would say. Let's try to address these issues. I guess that here the concept is how early we should go, or how much, the implementation of standard of care is important, and the combination with treatments, what this would add to have a better outcome in the adulthood. So I will read the question anyway. If you provide care earlier, so try to sort out everything before the child turns 12, will that influence adulthood? Meaning not just the treatment, but also all the other aspects of care for dying.
Yeah. So the answer is yes. The advancement in standard of care management, patients living with DMD improve the quality of life and life expectancy. And if we look at the treatments available for the last 20 years, there haven't been a lot of treatments available besides Atellurine in Europe. So we are using the cornerstone from a medical perspective, the corticosteroids. So it means the improvement standard of care, improved life expectancy, and quality of life. I'm not going to mention all the different aspects. Every patient, DMD, is unique. We need to take into account all the needs for every single specific patient, and the families and the environment. So of course, the occupational physical therapy, extremely important on the long term. Of course, the anticipation and management of the complications like scoliosis, like obesity and joints contracture are extremely important as well. We do list as well the psychosocial aspects, extremely important for the family and for the patients, and the school accommodations, and in order to better insertion and future opportunity in the future. And I would like, I'm interested, I'm based in France, I've been working at European level. I'm interested maybe to ask Professor Baranello, the difference, I will give you back 2 minutes, Professor Baranello. Yeah, you can. So maybe the difference, I mean, is everyone, beside early access, when we should, is everyone has access within the UK, if you compare it, other countries, to these early interventions? Is it easy? Is it well structured, or there is still improvement? This is in the UK.
Definitely we need to work in advance. Definitely we are struggling to to implement the standard of care properly due to capacity limitations and so on. Sometimes we need to convince family to start steroids, because we have seen that it's too difficult to see the advantages when your child is very young, and you only think about the side effects, the weight gain, and so on. But because we see then the long-term benefits, especially when the children were not on steroids and so on, sometimes, we need to take them on board, and say, look, this is working very well, so we should try. So yes, we should work well in advance, but I guess that there is also room for some improvement later on, especially when there are other aspects that for young adults or teenagers, are important, as we already mentioned.
And it's nice because if you hadn't asked, I would have asked, because I thought this is more a question for clinician than for the. So thanks for doing that. Next question is for Sarepta, and it's about carriers. And I think we heard about carriers a lot during this conference, and I think that is good. There's increased awareness now. But are there also potential therapies for dystrophinopathy carriers or female dystrophinopathies? I think is now the preferred term in the pipeline.
So it's George from Sarepta. So it's a very good question, and the short answer is at the moment there's not at the moment in our pipeline. So there's a few reasons behind this. I'm not going to talk too long. I know we have lunch coming up soon, so we can go to enjoy that. But with this area, we're at a point where we need more natural history data, better understanding. It's not well characterized. For example, last year, and I mean, Dr. Anna Sarkozy yesterday gave a 40-minute talk on this topic, and I hope it's recorded because it's definitely worth going back on. But she talked about the ENMC workshop that was last year in the Netherlands, and that is published online now that you can read. That has the current state of the art and what should be next. And also there is more a lay summary of that report too. So I definitely recommend to check that out. And one other thing to add is a registry. I think that's really important, that if you're not in a registry, it's very difficult to make headway in these areas where we don't fully understand the disease processes and what has to happen next. So we've nothing in our pipeline at the moment, but I can see that changing as we further understand the natural history. And if you also want to add anything, please feel free.
And maybe two things to add, and one, of course, is that, well, there is already treatment. If they have cardiomyopathy, that can be treated, so they should be monitored, even if the clinicians are stubborn and say, well, we never heard of this. They should be monitored, and then they can be treated if it develops. And the second thing is that exon skipping treatments won't work for carriers. They can make things worse. So that's something to be aware, and I can explain the genetics if you're interested, but not before lunch. But just bear in mind that there's certain treatments that are beneficial for Duchenne boys and men, but may actually be detrimental for carriers due to the way genetics work.
And also we should not forget that the Latins used to say primum non nocere, so you should not arm with a medication, So we know that this medication may have side effects, but of course the risk that you want to risk, when the situation is a little bit more complicated, there are more, of course, progression of the disease, probably are higher than the risk that you are able to take, when the situation is slightly or much better clinically, or can be managed with other medication for the heart, as it was mentioned, and so on. So there is always a balance. The next question for Roche. How can the Duchenne community and the Duchenne families can help through the approval process?
So the answer here is that unfortunately families can't directly help Roche or the pharmaceutical industry in terms of within the approval process. However, in terms of, we've obviously mentioned before that the first step is to achieve a license with the MHRA, and then the next step is where the clinical and cost effectiveness is reviewed either by NICE or by the Scottish Medicines Agency. And they very much appreciate and need and want and understand that they want to understand your perspective on how the medicines impact on quality of life, and are very, very, they see that only you have the unique insight into what it's like to live and have this condition, and also what it's like to have taken part in the clinical trials. You have the unique knowledge that their members want to understand as part of the approval process. And what I want to be able to do is to acknowledge the fantastic work that Action Duchenne and the MD UK and also Duchenne UK do to represent your voice and to make sure that it's fully heard within those approval processes. There are formal ways in which the organisations, the three that I've mentioned, come together to make sure that your unique insight and your experience is actually part of that approval process and that your voice is fully heard. What I also want to be able to do is to say that although I said that you can't help Roche directly or the pharmaceutical industry, is that every day you already are helping us. And it's really to say that for any boy or young man that's in the room that has considered or said yes or has taken part in a clinical trial, thank you. For every mum, dad, brother, sister, family relative, or carer who's helped someone to take part in a clinical trial. And we know it's not easy, but thank you. So we can't do what we do, all of us up here, without your help and support. So thank you.
I think, well, that's a very much appreciated answer. We're gonna go to the next one, which is for Santhera. Are there any gaps in the Duchenne therapeutic landscape that can be addressed by the stakeholder? And I don't know who the stakeholder is, but you can.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. So there are still many gaps in the Duchenne therapeutic landscape. And I'll take a generic approach to this answer. So there have been major advances from pharmaceutical companies and researchers with your support, and this has led to the development of gene therapies, tools that induce exon skipping, and other therapeutic approaches that are currently in clinical trial. So glucocorticoids remain a treatment that has been shown to slow disease progression despite some of the adverse effects. And we, as Santhera, because that's the only way I can approach this answer, aim to add to the landscape with an efficacious and well-tolerated therapy.
The next question is, which is the last one, yeah, Pfizer. Are you planning to implement artificial intelligence-based technology to enhance drug discovery and therapeutic efficiency?
So at Pfizer, we're already using artificial intelligence or AI-based technology to help us to develop and deliver potentially transformative treatments to patients as quickly as possible. And we use machine learning techniques to improve drug discovery, drug design and therapeutic efficiency, and to optimize our clinical trials. So AI models have been trained to virtually screen small molecules as potential therapies during the drug discovery process. And this enables compounds of interest to be identified and screened in a fraction of the time, and this aims to reduce inclusion of those with a lower probability of success or higher potential safety risks. We also use AI to predict important properties for large molecule therapies, so for example their viscosity or their thickness. And so by lowering the viscosity of monoclonal antibody treatments, the therapeutic dose can be given through a narrower needle, which improves the patient experience. And AI models have been trained to successfully optimize that particular property in less than half the time of traditional approaches. And Pfizer is also using AI to inform its clinical trial design. So machine learning analysis of real-world data and trial data can help to identify the patient subpopulations that might respond better to certain treatments. This can help us to define more precisely the patient subpopulations within our trials and to better understand what factors are affecting more the treatment response. more than others. Using AI can also help us to develop outcome measures that are more meaningful and less burdensome on people and their families, and that can better assess treatment effect. So, for example, Pfizer is utilising wearable devices to collect data on body movements of participants in its clinical trials, and this can measure continuous movement data, which are more representative of real-world activity, give a fuller picture of the person's experience and life at home, and can assess the effects of treatments in real time. And this approach is being used across different diseases, for example, assessing walking patterns in people with neurological conditions and nighttime scratching in people with skin conditions. Wearable devices also reduce the frequency of visits required for assessments, reducing the burden of trials on people and their families. And Pfizer's also using AI to analyse biomarkers of disease in its clinical trials. For example, machine learning algorithms can swiftly learn how to identify changes in body tissues, such as muscles, on MRI. And this enables deeper understanding of the changes, the biological changes that are actually happening over time during the course of a disease and in response to any treatments. So it's still early on in the landscape of AI and machine learning in the pharmaceutical industry, but these technologies already hold significant promise for bringing more effective treatments more quickly to the people that need them.
Thank you very much. So I want to thank, first of all, the industry representatives for all staying within 4 minutes. So that's much appreciated. And of course for answering all the questions. So let's give them a round of applause.